Ladies and gentlemen, dear supporters of Progress Foundation, dear friends, after an unusual long break, some of you might remember the brilliant and eye-opening presentation by Professor Lino Guzzella at our conference in September last year. It's a great pleasure for my fellow trustees and me to welcome so many of you again. My special welcome goes to our two keynote speakers, Professor Tom Ginsburg from the University of Chicago, I would say the expert worldwide on constitutions, and Professor Paul Kirchhoff, not only an eminent academic, but also a former member of the Federal Constitutional Court in Germany. You have more detailed CVs on your seats. And since the panel is as important as the speeches, I am glad that Julia Henny, member of the Swiss Federal Court and professor at the University of St. Gallen, and our board member Georg Vanberg, professor of political science at Duke University, will join and challenge the speakers on the panel. And Mark Dietli from the Market NZZ has done such a good job at our past conferences that he was also this time our first choice, and thanks God he accepted. So let's give all of them a big hand. I must say I'm a bit proud that we could again win such eminent personalities for our conference, not least due to my fellow trustee Georg Vanberg with his excellent network in political science and international law. As you probably have noticed, with the title The Rule of Law Under Pressure, our 57th Economic Conference tends to be more a legal than an economic conference. But this for two good reasons. First, we always have understood economics in a very broad sense. We therefore have organized conferences on many specific aspects of the economy and have presented political, psychological, cultural, religious, social, or historical perspectives, to name just a few. Second, even free market economies are embedded in a legal framework. If this legal framework is ill-constructed or not functioning well, the economy cannot succeed either. Dieser Zusammenhang von Rechtsstaatlichkeit und Marktwirtschaft ist für jeden Ordoliberalen von zentralem Interesse und größter Wichtigkeit. Auf den britischen Ökonomen John Greenwood geht die These zurück, dass für den wirtschaftlichen Erfolg eines Landes von den beiden Pfeilern einer freien politischen Ordnung, sofern man überhaupt wählen müsste, die Rechtsstaatlichkeit viel wichtiger wäre als die Demokratie. Pate stand dieser Beobachtung Greenwoods Erfahrung in Hongkong. Er arbeitete 20 Jahre lang in der damaligen Kronkolonie, die zwar keine Demokratie war, aber im Gegensatz zu heute sehr wohl ein Rechtsstaat und wirtschaftlich äußerst erfolgreich. Als wir in unserem Stiftungsrat das Thema der heutigen Konferenz festlegten, motivierten uns aber zwei andere Beobachtungen. Immer wieder hörten wir, selbst in bürgerlichen Freundeskreisen, Zweifel an der Lebenstüchtigkeit und Überlebensfähigkeit rechtsstaatlicher Demokratien. Sind nicht Diktaturen erfolgreicher in der Mobilisierung aller Kräfte, wenn es um strategische Ziele geht, ob in der Politik, im Militär, in der Forschung oder in der Wirtschaft. Die Zweifel erinnern an den Sputnik-Schock von 1957, als der Westen die Überlegenheit der Sowjetunion fürchtete. Wir wissen, was daraus geworden ist. Ferner unterminieren nicht Diktaturen unsere Demokratie und unseren Rechtsstaat mit Manipulationen aller Art und Fake News? Darf man daher dem demokratischen Mehrheitsentscheid überhaupt noch trauen? Das führt direkt zur zweiten Beobachtung, nämlich dass neben diesem schwindenden Glauben an die internationale Stärke der rechtsstaatlichen Demokratien auch das Spannungsfeld von Rechtsstaatlichkeit und Demokratie innerhalb der westlichen Länder zunehmend zum Thema wird. Man denke nur an die politisierte Besetzung der Richterposten im obersten Gerichtshof der USA. Nicht wenige würden zudem am liebsten unter dem Vorwand, es gelte, populistische Strömungen zu bekämpfen, die Demokratie mit juristischen Mitteln einhegen, einengen und damit letztlich aushöhlen wollen. Ich halte das nicht etwa für freiheitssichernd, sondern für freiheitsgefährdend. Und für ein direkt demokratisches Land wie die Schweiz kommt das schon gar nicht in Frage. Wir haben nur ein Bundesgericht, aber kein oberstes Verfassungsgericht, das der Politik und dem Souverän Grenzen setzt. Sind wir deswegen etwa kein Rechtsstaat? Die Frage stellen heißt sie verneinen. Die Gefahr, dass sich Richter in die Politik verirren und über die gesetzgebende Gewalt hinwegsetzen, ist hierzulande zwar auch existent, aber deutlich kleiner als anderswo. Die halbdirekte Demokratie nach Schweizer Muster bedroht den Rechtsstaat jedenfalls weniger als Richter, die kein Maß kennen und sich als Gesetzgeber zu betätigen versuchen, wie wir das mit dem Urteil des Europäischen Gerichtshofs für Menschenrechte erlebt haben, wonach die Schweiz mit ihrer zu wenig forschen Klimapolitik die Menschenrechte älterer Frauen verletze. Es tönt fast paradox, ist es aber leider nicht. Ausgerechnet Richter, nämlich Richter, die sich als Aktivisten und Politiker verstehen, werden so zu Totengräbern des Rechtsstaates und der Demokratie in einem. The procedure for our conferences is always the same. The speeches and the discussion are recorded and filmed and will be accessible on our website within a few days. Our guest from overseas, Tom Ginsburg, speaks first in his native tongue, then follows immediately the second speaker in German, and then without any break, the panel under the lead of Mark Dietli, where all participants speak in their mother tongue. The panel should end at 1:05 precisely, so that I can close up with my final remarks and that you will get some finger food and perhaps a glass of wine at 1:15 the latest. And now, Tom Ginsburg, the floor is yours.
I'm in Switzerland, so I will start my timer to make sure that I do not go over my allocated 20 minutes. I'd also like to congratulate them on identifying what is perhaps the central challenge of our times. It's a dark moment with rule of law challenges clearly present under the surface in the United States as we face the prospect of a second Trump administration, in Europe with the backsliding democracies of Poland and Hungary, which have, of course, made the rule of law a central challenge in both cases. It is sometimes said in the United States, the early founders said that the courts were the least dangerous branch. But today's populists act as if the courts are the most dangerous branch, and they seek to take them over as soon as they can. The question then is what we do about this. And so I've titled my talk, How to Preserve the Rule of Law, Pragmatic Considerations. What do we do in the face of political movements which seem to want to undermine the rule of law? It's worth noting that the rule of law is in some sense the central political ideal of our time. Like democracy itself, it attracts people who proclaim that they are loyal to it when in fact they are not. North Korea, the official name of North Korea is of course the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which it's at least Korea. I don't think many of those other things are true, but the rule of law is similar. We have an ideal which attracts not only the American Bar Foundation, Jürgen Habermas, scholars all over the world, but also the Chinese Communist Party, which claims to be implementing the rule of law with Chinese characteristics. So it's that kind of global ideal. Who could be against acting according to law? And that makes it challenging for scholars. There are many, many conceptual debates about exactly what the rule of law is. I won't go through them for you. To me, at the core, the rule of law means a mechanism to prevent arbitrary government. But in our tradition, in the Anglo-American tradition, the focus is always on courts, on independent courts that decide cases according to law. In the German tradition, I think you have a better concept, the Rechtsstaat, which is much more about impartial administration throughout the government. And so that might be a better concept. Scholars, in analyzing the rule of law, debate how thick to make it. That is, what other aspects do they bring in to the concept of the rule of law? Does it require the protection of human rights? Does it require democracy? And again, there's many, many ways to think about this. The concept is important because the rule of law is not just a political ideal, but it's also now a multi-billion-dollar industry. There are many efforts by development agencies and others to transfer the rule of law to all countries in the world, to try to help developing countries unlock democracy and economic growth, which we think are correlated with the rule of law. And so that's also led to many debates. That leads to questions. Is it amenable to change from the outside? How is the rule of law sustained? And what exactly can be done to improve it in places where it is in decline? Let me just focus on one of the measures that we have for the rule of law. There's a large literature about how do we measure it, and there's one that I have some association with, the World Justice Project, which surveys people all over the world. And one of their measures is an overall measure of the rule of law, and this is from last year. Countries in red have shown a decline in the rule of law. Countries in blue have shown an improvement. I guess it's good to be France or Spain, Italy too. But much of the rest of the world you can see is fairly dark red. The rule of law is declining in public perception. That's the basis of this data. When you look not just at the direction, but the overall state, in this figure, we look, the green colors have a high level of rule of law. The red do not, have a poor or no rule of law. And then you see most of the countries, including my own, are somewhere in between dark green and orange. That's itself disturbing, that a country like the United States is no longer producing in its own citizens a sense that the rule of law exists. And that gives me great fear. I want to spend a little bit talking about the United States because of our election this year and how important it is to sustain the rule of law. And in this regard, I think the picture is quite mixed. In general, the rule of law to the extent it depends on the Supreme Court, perception of the Supreme Court, is in grave trouble. We have been asking the public what do they think of the Supreme Court for 3 or 4 decades. Actually, it goes back to the 1950s. And the ratings are at an all-time low. They are now only about a third of Americans approve of the Supreme Court. It's hard to have a strong legal system when the highest court is seen by many Americans as highly politicized, as not making decisions based on the law. And we could argue about it, and they're probably not as bad as people's perception is. In some cases, in others, they're probably worse than most people perceive. But the whole point is that that perception itself creates a problem. If people do not believe the courts are going to be deciding cases according to law, they will themselves perhaps act less according to law. They will push the boundaries. So I really worry about that. By the way, the key moment for the Supreme Court when their ratings really started to drop was the Dobbs decision of a couple years ago when the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. And they were brought in, you may remember, in 2016, our election was basically about the Supreme Court. I think without the issue of the Supreme Court, Donald Trump would not have won that election. Because by making the election about the Supreme Court, the evangelical Christian voters decided to vote for this man. And once he was in power, he did as promised, he appointed the justices, and they did overturn the case of Roe v. Wade, which had allowed abortion nationally. They won that battle. We'll see if they win the war because there's been a big backlash. But the big point is that the institution is no longer as popular as it used to be. It's also the case that we see massive attacks on the administrative state, the legitimacy of bureaucrats, who, after all, are absolutely essential to democracy. Bureaucracy, of course, gets a bad name. No one likes bureaucracy when they're confronting it. But democracy depends, in my view, on neutral bureaucrats who are upholding or acting according to rules that were announced in advance. And the most obvious way to see this is to think about the administration of elections. Elections officials have to count the vote according to the rules laid out in advance, or you don't have democracy. And I think that that's an important thing, which is itself under attack, the vote counting in the United States. It's also the case that a neutral civil service helps democracy survive, a neutral civil service acting according to rule of law. Why is that? Because if you don't have a neutral civil service, and many countries do not, many poor and developing countries, the incoming president can hire and fire hundreds of thousands of state officials. In that kind of system, whoever has power can never give it up because their whole coalition, their tribe, their people it's necessary for them to remain in power. So you need a kind of neutrality to lower the stakes of elections enough that people will give up power. And when we see these attacks on the administrative state, when we see plans to politicize the appointments of minor officials in the federal government, we have to be very worried. A third reason that I'm afraid is the massive amount of election misinformation. Again, elections require the rule of law, and they produce results that we can verify. That's absolutely necessary. But the attempts to undermine even the people who are counting the votes is very, very disturbing. In our country in 2020, in my view, our democracy was saved by tens of thousands of local election officials who acted according to law, counted the ballots accurately, and in the face of sometimes very serious intimidation and pressure, reported the results, and we got through it. We still see this result being denied, which I think we have to perceive as an attack on the rule of law itself, as well as an attack on democracy. All of that makes for a depressing story, but I do have one optimistic note. And this has to do with the cases that have come out after that attempt to overthrow the election in January 6th of 2020 and the efforts leading up to it. The reason that I have some optimism about that is that many of the people who were involved are themselves being tried or are going to jail for their role. And that could include the low-level rioters, but also, of course, the people who tried to produce fake slates of electors. That's obviously a violation of law. Obviously, you can't have a democracy or the rule of law if you don't punish that. And we've seen many trials. Think about what sustains democracy and the rule of law. It is not the virtue of the man who happens to, or woman who happens to be elected president. That's the rule of man. The rule of law requires that if someone breaks the rules, they will be punished whether they are the president or have high office. And what we have seen since January 6th is a lot of low-level trials, not making the news in Europe or even really the United States, which I think are of central importance. Think about the calculation that one would go through if you are, let's say, a close associate of a president who wants to overturn the government. You might say to yourself, well, I really like this guy, and if he succeeds, I'll be powerful and I'll maybe make some more money and such. What if he fails? There, the crucial thing is that people understand that they will be punished. They will suffer professional and maybe criminal sanction for violating the rules. And that's why these trials now are so important, because they say to the people around the next time, the future January 6, 2028, if that is to happen, that, I'm not sure I want to go to jail. I'm not sure I want to lose my license to practice law by going along with this scheme. So the rule of law depends not on leaders, but on the people around them and prospects of punishment. And here the United States is very lucky because we have a federal system. Many of these Trump trials now are going on at the state level, which means they will go on regardless of the election and have completely separate bases. They can't pardon someone a president cannot pardon someone for violating a state law or being punished by state court. So that's helpful to us. So that's sort of three scary things and one good bright side. In thinking about the United States, I always argue against American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism is the idea that we're somehow special and the forces that apply to other countries don't apply to us. That's wrong. Which means I think we can learn something from what I call near misses. What do I mean by a near miss? A situation in which democracy is under some threat, backsliding, things look like they're going very badly, but then something happens at the last minute to stop the decline and to improve the situation. And there are many examples of these kind of things around the country, around the world. I tend to think of situations in which you have a leader who really wants to stay in power and something happens. Indira Gandhi, for example, in the 1970s, a man named Mahinda Rajapaksa in Sri Lanka, who was trying to take over the system, somehow lost an election, called out the military, they didn't come. They didn't join with him. And so on. There's many examples. One of the things that we learn from these cases is that when the rule of law is preserved, it is because of institutions like courts, like militaries, like police forces, like electoral commissions, which are not themselves legitimated democratically, right? They are legitimated in a kind of technocratic logic. We apply the rule of law regardless of who is there. That's a kind of technocratic logic. And those are the kind of ideals which are necessary in every case where you have a near miss. Just to provide a quick example, Rajapaksa tried to, as I say, call out the military to support him in staying in power. They said no. He went to the Supreme Court, said overturn the election. They said no. He went to the Electoral Commission, said give me some more votes. They said no. And we see the same thing in the United States, that it was many, many individual institutions, not a single one, not the Supreme Court alone, but networks of institutions, which are absolutely critical to preserve the rule of law when it is in decline. You need institutions that will support each other in their kind of technocratic logic in the rule of law. I think it's absolutely critical. This is very important because the world we're in now is one where democratic progress and backsliding are non-linear. What do I mean by that? Sometimes you have someone like Rajapaksa who lost power in a surprise election, but then came back 3 years later as the Speaker of Parliament. Or you have possibly a second Trump administration coming right up. Indira Gandhi came back. Benjamin Netanyahu, who's in the news a lot, has dominated Israeli politics, but lost power a couple years ago for a year and then came back. This means it's all the more important to think of the rule of law as completely institutional. We have to have institutional protections. We can't rely on good people or honest leaders. That will cost us dearly. We need to protect these institutions. Now, how exactly do we do that? Well, the Poland situation is rather interesting at this time. Poland, as you know, has had a party that really did try to take over the courts. 2 of the Constitutional Court justices for the last decade were illegally appointed. That's been confirmed at the European level. Now, a new government has come into power. What do? It's a big problem for the rule of law. Obviously, these judges were issuing decisions. Do you just set those aside? Well, then your people have relied on them. It's not obvious that that's what you should do. Should you purge the judges and put in new judges? That's not obvious either, because once you get into a purging or a cleaning of an institution, then you're inviting the next time in the nonlinear process of decline a purge of your people. And soon, institutions are simply completely politicized. So I think a little forbearance is actually required, which is a formal matter, a formal legal matter, actually is not consistent with the rule of law. We have to say, okay, well, we let them stay because we need, and this is where I think the perspective here, which Dr. Schwarz was saying, the idea that we have to take a broader view than just the law. We have to understand the economics and the politics of these things. Sometimes it's important to withhold punishment in the interests of a longer-term game, but it's a very inexact science. And this is why I titled my talk Pragmatics. It's like we don't really know what to do in this situation, but sometimes a little forbearance might be required. 2 other points I want to make. First of all, I think a critical thing here is norms of professionalism. Some of the people who participated in the Trump attempt to overturn our elections have suffered professional sanctions. If you're a lawyer, your ability to practice law is not determined by the government, it's determined by the Bar Association. And the Bar Associations have, in some cases, said, no, you've obviously violated the rule of law. You're not committed to the rule of law. And that can be very important for incentivizing people to behave properly if they're thinking ahead to what might happen. I think that's probably true not just of law, but other professions too. Election administrators, counter-corruption commissions, auditors, they all have professional norms. And those professional norms should be reinforced to take into account a deep commitment to the rule of law, to impartiality, and to democratic maintenance. The other point I want to make is what I phrase it, the rule of law matters all the way down. What do I mean by that? In our country, we can't always rely on the top-level institutions like the Supreme Court. The rule of law matters at the level of the local policeman and the local court and the county officials who are counting ballots in our very decentralized system. That means that we have to, despite, I suppose, what's happening in Washington, we have to reinforce this idea of the ethics and the professional norms of those people. And I think with that, in a country as large as ours, we might survive. I think the same holds true of a country like Poland, where even today you had lower-level judges who themselves maintain the rule of law and decide cases accurately, even as at the high level the judges were being manipulated by the governing party until last year and such. And so this idea that we have to instill the values of the rule of law at the cultural level, at the professional level, all the way throughout the country is probably the only way that we will survive in the face of the grave challenges that we all are witnessing today with regard to the rule of law. Thank you very much.